Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Jonas. Appreciate it.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm delighted to be here this morning and talk about talent. And as you mentioned earlier, Carl, this was a great lead-in terms of trends that are shaping organizations and how they think about the world and the structural changes that are occurring. And what I'd like to do is to spend a bit of time and talk about the changes in the labor markets that in part are because of these mega trends, but in part also structural in themselves. And a lot of them are tied to what's happening in the world of technology, so that you have an ability to think about your organization's capabilities and assets and how you may want to think about rebuilding it so that they are able to navigate in this rapidly changing environment. And we had a question earlier on, which is about, so how should I think about talent? And I think, there are some very important things that you should consider as you try and navigate, a world of certain uncertainty. First, let me start a little bit about Manpower Group. We're a company that was founded almost 70 years ago by two lawyers who were working on a legal brief. They had a lot of work and they decided that they needed some help. And they went out into the market and they found a woman with great skills who helped them prepare the legal brief. As you know, right after the Second World War, a lot of women, and that was really the start of the explosion of the female workforce participation in the US, were manning the work that was left when the soldiers were fighting in Europe. So a big skilled workforce available. They started tapping into that, and that's how our industry and our company was born. We're slightly unusual in that we're a US-based $20 billion company, but 15% of our business is outside of the US, and we went global or international very early in our lives. We're in most of the emerging markets in well over 50 years. So we have a great view of what's happening in different parts of the world. And I mention all of this not as much as talk about what it is and what our roots are, but from those activities. So 12 million people come to us with about the same ratio as Mike had, 12 million people, and we employ about 3.5 million people in those 80 countries every year. Any given day, so today on this Thursday, we have about 600,000 people working for us in those 80 countries. So we have a great understanding of the ebbs and flows of local labor markets, and we're also able to look at some trends that really are global or regional in their nature. We understand what is cyclical and what's structural. And I think when you consider your own organizations and when you think about labor markets, we tend to think about labor markets in a cyclical fashion. When the economy goes down, the labor markets go down. When the economy goes up, the labor markets improve and unemployment drops. And I'm here to tell you today that a lot of the changes that you're seeing occurring right now are structural in nature, and of course, in some cases, masked by different parts of where we are in the cycle. Which means as you navigate your organizations, just as it means for us as we navigate this kind of environment, we have to make strategic choices on how we build our business and how we see those trends. And that's what we've done. So you may know us here in the US in particular as a company doing temporary staffing. But based on those trends that we really saw start to come to the fore about 7 years ago, we started to diversify our business very aggressively. And it'll be no surprise to you when I say that we thought technology would have a really big and important role to play in the world at large, as you saw from the mega trend, but in the labor markets in particular. Which means for us to be able to help our clients, we have to develop resourcing capabilities globally for, in particular, IT skills. So we have about 30,000 resources within the IT field all over the world, augmenting staff, trying to build new organizational model to help organizations. So we have that. We have more outcome-based businesses. So that's why we are now Manpower Group, because we've diversified and built our business based on our understanding of the trends that we saw. And just as Mike said, some of these trends are so structural that it's really more about math than anything else. Some of them, sometimes you wonder whether things are fads. When you're dealing with masses of data points like this, and they're very global in nature, you understand that it's going to happen. You may not know exactly when, but you know it's going to happen, and you can prepare yourself for that environment. Because the advent of these megatrends, what it all means to me as a business leader is we live in a world of certain uncertainty. I am a CEO of what is and has traditionally been a very cyclical business. We are in labor markets in lots of places. They tended to be very disconnected. Today they're all connected in terms of the globalization, and something bad happening in Europe will eventually mean something bad happens in China and vice versa, and then the US gets involved. And I'm standing here today thinking about the world somewhat differently than I thought about it 5 months ago. 5 months ago I would have said, the economic cycle, as slow and painful as it is clearly improving. Things are moving in the right direction, and Europe will make its way through the troubles. And then Russia goes crazy. And France, is still not doing its structural reforms, and you're starting to see Europe come into what could be a third recession. Now, I don't believe it's going into a third recession, but I don't know. So this is the kind of environment organizations have to deal with, which means that your ability as an organization to predict the future is going to be very difficult with any kind of certainty. So what you have to build instead is a strategic capability to be agile and to maximize the time to value. So how quickly can you bring value to the marketplace is going to be really, really important. Because your ideas about building on long-term 9-year cycles or 8-year cycles or 5-year cycles with certainty may or may not, or may no longer be true. So you have to be able to navigate in a different environment. So when it comes to the world of work and the changes that we see, in part because of the mega trends that Mike was talking about earlier, we've identified 4 trends that we think are happening and are within the world of work clear structural changes. And the first one has to do with the demographics, and you heard about that actually yesterday a little bit. You heard about it again this morning. This is math. Birth rates in 60 countries are not replacing the number of people that are dying, so populations are on the decline. Japan is the most egregious example, but you have most of the developed world in Europe already having populations that are dropping quite rapidly. So you have to be able to manage an outflow from the workforce. And why is this important? Because if a population doesn't grow, the only way the economy can grow is that you are doing more with less that is outpacing the decline of your population, or else your economic growth won't happen. So therefore, and that bet hasn't been won ever, population in the end wins. Note this week, China's economy is bigger than the US economy, not per capita, of course, but just in its size. And eventually, China will continue to make improvements on their GDP. So this is something to be aware of, because many of you, I'm sure, are starting to feel and have felt for some time difficulties in attracting and retaining talent. And the fact that you have an outflow of people is something that over the long term means you have to have very clear strategies, because there will be less people with the right skills to choose from. And of course, the demographic changes and the aging means you'll have more generations at work that you have to manage and understand how you attract and retain, because they all come from very different backgrounds. And what's interesting here in this notion in terms of generations, I challenge you to go back and read, a Time article, a New York Times, or whatever you want from the 70s or the 60s. And you'll have an article that talks about, the generational chasm and how the, current generation is less focused on the collective good and more focused on their individual well-being. So, that is not new. This just feels new to all of us in this room, because we're part of the generation that's looking back at the new generation thinking, oh, what are these guys up to? And what are they thinking? But I think what's new here is that this is the first global generation. All of the other generations have been defined by geographic boundaries. This latest generation has more or less, as we look a lot of the candidates that come to us, some belief systems that are similar. And that's going to be important to understand, and a great opportunity in terms of attraction strategies, but also something to be aware of, because transformation can happen very quickly in different parts of the world and leapfrog what would normally take much, much longer in terms of their belief systems. So when we then think about these individuals and the fact that they have choices, I think it's important to talk about who's got the choice. Not everybody has choices. People with the right skills that you employ got plenty of choices. We'll have more choices. With the workforce and demographics and what's happening, it's going to be harder to attract the right talent because the pipeline of those kinds of skills aren't very robust and are not about to exponentially grow to compensate for the increase in demand, of course, because all of us are going to use more skilled people to do more work. But there's a large part of the workforce that does not have the adequate skills, which is why you're seeing this bifurcation. And we talked about this yesterday, and you heard Urs get the questions on what's going to happen, and you're seeing it happening today. The average unemployment rate that we'll hear about tomorrow in the U.S. is probably 6%. It's a meaningless number. The unemployment rate for those with no skills is 15, and the unemployment rate for those with skills is 2.5. And the average happens to be 6. Doesn't talk at all about what's happening underneath. And there's no indications that that bifurcation is about to slow down. It's about to increase. It's going to be harder for us as organizations to find people with the skills that we want at the right time and at the right price. And it's also going to mean that there are large parts of the population, the workforce population, is going to have a really tough time to find gainful employment and make a living that can sustain their families. Now, you'd think that this is only the case in developed countries, but many of you do business in emerging markets, and you'll tell me that talent is hard, if not harder, to find in some of those markets. And that's where this whole interest in globalization and technology and all of that is coming together. Because with the help of information and technology, the aging of the population in emerging markets is more than twice the rate of what we lived through as developed countries. So the average age of, the average family in Bangladesh used to be 7 kids in the late 70s. The average family now is 2.2 kids. Women have access to more medicine, information, contraception, birth rates decline, the population gets older at a much, much faster rate. So most of the emerging markets are in a race to get rich before they get old. And that's what you're seeing in places like China. Now, to compete and do exactly what China does in manufacturing, what do? They buy equipment from Germany, first generation. What kind of skills you need to run equipment from Germany? The same kind of skills you need to run the same equipment in Germany. It's just that their talent pool in China is much, much smaller. And that's why you have wage inflation, which goes up to 15-20% for those kinds of skills. And you do that for 12 years. And now you can see that between logistics, geopolitical risk, things like that, manufacturing is coming back to the US because the overall equation in a really short time, 15 years, has gone from an unbeatable manufacturing advantage to the Chinese saying, okay, well, we're going to be focused on our domestic market and hope it goes well because, as a powerhouse, we're not going to continue at the same rate exporting because cheap labor today sits in Vietnam or in Cambodia and eventually in Indonesia as well. So that raise for the wage arbitrage is something that they will not be able to build a sustainable competitive advantage for very long. So individuals have choices. Attracting these individuals is going to be very important. And of course, when you think about the impact of technology, yesterday we heard from the professor at Stanford, that this is exponential. And it's true. Humans have a tough time thinking what happens when the rate of change is exponential. We had the example yesterday. There's the example of the rice grains on the chessboard and how things just take off and goes very quickly. I would argue this is nothing new. We have lived through technological transformation like this in the past. If you think about, and if you step back and you look at the evolution of the population growth curve from the beginning to now looks almost exponential. And it starts to ramp up really fast about 1860. Anybody remember 1860 or 1855, something like that? What happened? When you could disproportionately do a lot more than you could just the decade before. Who's got an idea? Steam. Steam drove tremendous exponential power, transport opportunities. Urbanization started with steam. You could live far away, get stuff to the city, get the food to the people, even though they were living, food was being done somewhere else. So you could have exploding cities, and that trend just continues. So I would argue that technology and exponential change that we've seen is not new. We've had it in the past in many different places. I think what is, and as I think about technology, the difference with technology today is speed. Everything is compressed in time, which means you have to, as an organization, be able to get more out of the things you want to do faster because you don't know how quickly it will change, and you can just see how things are evolving at a much more rapid pace. And this is, of course, also true in terms of how it impacts work. Today, you can build your organizations, thinking about remote work. You have to think about what kind of work do you do where, by whom, and at what price. And it used to be geographically constrained. Today, you're having decreasing geographic constraints as you think about where to put the workforce. A question that gets asked and complained about a lot is what's happening at this point of the labor market cycle in the US. You should be starting to see more sustained wage inflation, which is exactly the same question that you have in lots of other parts of the developed countries, and frankly also in some parts of emerging markets. And I believe that one of the effects of technology here is you have full market transparency on costs. So you could ask yourself, it's so hard to find engineers in the UK, why wouldn't engineers be paid as bankers? Because there comes a pain point when the cost of an engineer in the UK means your costs of the product becomes too expensive to compete on in the global marketplace. So you have a natural dampening effect, which is why there is a dampening effect on low-cost service jobs or low-skilled service jobs that haven't seen wage inflation in any sustained way for the last 30 years in the US, not dissimilar to a lot of other developed markets. So you have tremendous opportunities and tremendous impacts with technology. And last but not least, organizations really, as it relates to talent, think about talent now with the sophistication of a supply chain. So the supply and demand, what needs to get done, when it gets done, is much better understood by organizations today than ever before. Very sophisticated. If you think about the downturn that we experienced during the recession, 95% of the drop in demand was absorbed by the workforce over a 6-month period. Never happened before. The downturns in the 70s, you have a downturn. As a company, you take the hit 80% and you absorb it 20% by the people you tell to go away for about 2 months, but please stay in touch because I'm going to need you soon because this is going to be a short cycle. I'm going to need your skills and talent. The reason it dropped so fast is the company had instantaneous information on what was happening with their demand. So they reacted very, very quickly and brought their workforce down in the US. And of course, that rigidity that exists in Europe means their unemployment stays higher and also doesn't go down as quickly. So much broader band, much smaller band of reaction in terms of the unemployment rates. But in the US, which is essentially free market in terms of supply and demand, you could go down really fast. And that kind of sophistication is what you can only expect to see more of as you think about your understanding of where you need your talent. So every CEO is really faced with the same dilemma to understand, how do I execute my business strategies given the uncertainties that I see in terms of the demand, in terms of the uncertainties that we experience of talent. And we believe that having a great workforce strategy combined with your business strategy is going to be essential to succeed. You can have the best laid plans scuppered by your inability to find the right talent to do the job so that you can execute on your strategies. Because you have a few, interrelated conundrums that are happening. On the one hand, you have a skills mismatch, which is widening and not decreasing. On the other hand, you have governments are local by their very nature. They only think about, their business within a geography. You think about your business in terms of a global environment, whether you know it or not. With technology today, a small or medium-sized business in the Midwest is competing with somebody in Italy or with somebody in China. Flow of information and services and products much more open today. And then last but not least, as you mentioned earlier, Carl, talent is increasingly mobile because you can do a lot of work in different places and still be productive. And you can have scale as an individual by leveraging technology. So, as you think about what this means for your organizations, we believe there are three things that you need to, be very aware of. And the first one is, of course, very much addressing the question earlier that we had, which is, what am I going to do? You know and you will know more about your capabilities of having different work models. What needs to be done by yourselves, what needs to be done by people that are not within your organization but affiliated with your organization, what can be done by somebody completely outside. So much in the same discussion that we had around cloud, where you're thinking the unthinkable, the hardest stuff, the most sensitive stuff, you should think about putting out on the cloud. So counterintuitive, just because somebody is there working at this all the time, probably being exposed to more pressures in that area than you'll experience in 10 years, with more expertise and time to market being so important. You've heard, and yesterday I spoke to some of you about how you're using, online resources. You're using crowdsourcing. The professor yesterday talked about, this notion of hyper-specialization, how you divide work into components, and you farm out that work. So you know that the legal sector employs, a lot fewer lawyers today. Part of the reason is that they've divided their work, and they send some of the discovery work to companies offshore that run huge databases and churn through the discovery process at a sixth of the cost, and give it back to the resources that are onshore, who then do an interpretation. And you'd be surprised at the level of sophistication that you can do when you start to divide it up like that. And the efficiency, you've heard about this in the medical field as well. X-rays are being reviewed by somebody who reviews 1,500 X-rays of that kind of fracture, every month, versus a doctor who sees them every three times in a month, and how you're able to divide work like that. So that's what you can expect. You can expect, and you should think about, what kind of work models are there, and what should I be doing as I face this kind of uncertainty, and my business is asking me, or is required to drive it in a very different way. The other part is, of course, people practices. You've got 4 generations at work. You've got individuals with lots of choices, lots of organizations to go to. What is it that you need to do to attract and retain the people? Because certainly attraction would be very important. But as you heard from what I've just talked about, you're not going to be accessing widely increasing talent pools. They're going to be shrinking as the economy improves. So how do you retain your people and make them more productive and get them to feel exactly what Mike talked about earlier, which is, I am here and I need to become more marketable in terms of my skills. Because I don't know whether you're going to employ me or not, because you live in the world of certain uncertainty. And in the 80s, I saw that you fired all my parents who'd been with you for 30 years. So my belief and loyalty to you is limited by what I'm seeing actually occurring. And frankly, as organizations, I don't believe any of us can say to somebody, look, stay with me, you're good to go for the next 30 years, pension coming, we're fine. We're going to say, look, we're going to help you grow, and we're going to help you be marketable. And if individuals don't see you provide that path of growth, they will go outside and they will build their own portfolio in terms of the individuals with the choices. So, that's going to be really important to give some careful thought to that. And then, of course, where do you find the talent, and how can you engage the talent? You will have so many more opportunities to engage talent in different parts of the world to do different things than you ever thought possible. Of course, you can also see a lot of governments start to realize the demographic crunch and talk about, okay, how do we get more women into the workforce? Japan. If you listen to Prime Minister Abe 3 years ago, his view is demographics is going to hell. We're not allowing any immigration, so I think all women should stay at home and have kids, and therefore, there'll be more babies and our population will be saved. That's an experiment that's gone very badly, aside from any opinions you may have on, the stance itself. And he's just reversed it and now is trying to do everything he can to make it easier for women where they have a low female workforce participation to get into the workforce. Because women will make their own choices in terms of what they want their lives like. And staying at home and only having kids so that the nation will have some demographic growth is not one of them, surprisingly. So he's completely 180 degrees changed his stance. So you'll see that organizations as well as nations are going to start to do things to try and boost their demographic talent pool, or their talent pool, nationwide, so that they can provide the talent that's needed. Because in the end, that's what's going to make the difference, I think, for our organizations, your organizations, as well as nations. Access to skilled talent is going to be what makes the difference between, successful business outcomes and, successful nationwide growth or not. So those are some of the thoughts that we have based on what we see in the labor markets. But I'd love to hear any reflections or thoughts that you have on those. If you're seeing some of this happening in your organizations, if you're having a tough time finding talent, as well as any other reflections that you may have on the labor markets. Please.
Around the value of university education in all these people are getting these degrees from could be marginal institutions, getting in marginal disciplines, and using the apprenticeships or that kind of vehicle within organizations like that happens in Germany. How could organizations here start thinking about that and reallocating those types of folks rather than them going into the workplace in debt, starting much earlier and building the skills they need?
Yeah, no, and I think. In some ways, some of the issue is really US-centric, because most of the rest of the world provides education, whether you have the skills and you have universal access to education, at a reasonably low cost to people that want to educate themselves further. Right? So you have mismatches between people who think they need certain skills and they like to do something, not really thinking about what it is that it takes to get to be employable at the end of it. So a lot of people that are graduate ready but not work ready. Now the US has a very particular problem in that the cost of education is so high. So one thing is to make a mistake as an individual and say, oh, I started with something and now I'm off to something else. So that's bad news. In our case, it's a hugely bad situation because that student debt has risen and could possibly be a big issue for a lot of people as they have a tough time finding the right match. So it's clear that there are more college graduates, 4-year college graduates today than what the employment demand is in the US. It's also clear that there's not enough 2-year college or technical vocational training graduates in the US, so it'd be good to see some of that rebalancing. And as you correctly point out, some countries, and some of you faced with a lot of these, whether you know it or not, you're faced with some of these structural changes, you're starting to think about apprenticeships. I'm going to take somebody in. I'm going to go to high schools. I don't know how I'm going to find somebody in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but I'm going to go to these high schools. I'm going to tell them working on a manufacturing floor today is a lot different than what your parents are telling you. So that linkage is very, very clear. You can see countries that have it in their systems, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, they have an unemployment rate, average unemployment rate that's not too much lower than their youth unemployment rate. But by and large, if you look at the world, whatever unemployment rate it is, times 2 or 3, that's your youth unemployment rate. And in the skills mismatch era, people who are outside of the workforce after they left school, not getting employed, have a permanent wage scar that carries with them all the way through their lives, maybe making 15 to 20% less than if they had started working at a much earlier stage.
What do you see as the most effective employer branding with regard to attracting talent? And granted your comments about uncertainty, how do you expect that to evolve going forward?
Well, I think most young people that we talk to, given the uncertainty, given what they've seen happening to their parents and the kind of environment we live in, would say that I'm willing to invest a lot into your company as long as you give me something as well. So help me improve my skills portfolio so that I can make sure that my marketability moves independent of what you do. So I think that's one of the ways to think about your branding, to make sure it's a path. I may not be your destination, I may not be your home forever, but I'm going to be a great way to help you build employment skills or employment security, since job security is something that's not there. And the other part is, truly I believe, as you speak to a lot of young people with the right skills, they make life choices, just as Mike talked about. They look at, what is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? Are we doing well as a business, but what role do I have in this organization? What is the role of the organization at large? So the search for meaning, and so to understand, okay, if I'm going to spend a lot of time helping your organization be successful and you helping me as well, hopefully, what is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? What is the greater good? And it may sound fluffy, but as far as we can tell from a lot of young people coming in, and surprisingly, and this is where the younger generations become global, we hear this in China, we hear this in India, you hear this in Argentina. That understanding and that desire is manifest, almost globally. Not by everybody, because of course you have, Maslow, first you need to have some money to eat. But very quickly, once you get beyond that, you come into this, I want to understand what I belong to and that I can buy into.
What are your thoughts about the organizational structure that's going to be fit for purpose given this very different kind of talent pool and relationship?
I think you'll want to think about, some of the traditional thoughts around what are the core capabilities and skills that you believe are necessary to be successful, and what are the other things that you don't see as your long-term or any capability that you need to have in-house. So I do think that your notion of, and we talked about freelance markets, how you engage with people with specific skills in a spot market for a certain time, you have to get comfortable with that. Because most organizations who have the resources will say, no, I want to have all of these people within my organization. They're important to me. But in the future, you'll know they're important for you for a much shorter time span than you might be able to anticipate. So you'll have to think about, how do I access various talent sources and engage with them in different ways? Sometimes you'll do it through technology platforms. Sometimes you'll do it through, partners that you work with. And you're going to probably work with partners in a much more collaborative way, external to your organization in the future than you've done in the past. And as we think, for instance, about how we use Google and how that works for us, it's very interesting because the way I think about the security of our data is very much, I'm trying to understand, okay, can I attract the right amount of people with the right amount of skills to protect our data on a continuous basis against all the things we don't know anything about? And the answer is, maybe somebody can, but it's not our organization. So therefore, I'm trying to align myself with partners that have those capabilities and then run with it in that way. And I think that's rethinking that organizational model and making sure it's also pretty dynamic. Because what's good now, you've got to be ready to change it 5 years from now. So you have to evaluate it all the time, because we're not moving from one state to another. It's going to be very dynamic over, for all I know, forever. So you have to build this agility as a strategic capability for your organization.